We're honored to have Jane Hansen as our reviewer again, who is joining us for the second time, so we didn't scare her away after the first time. She's come back to see us again. And for those of you that might not know, she does teach English at San Antonio College. She clearly loves books, which is quite evident by her enthusiasm in reviewing. And we look forward to her visits. So I'm not taking up the spot any longer. I'm turning it over to Jane. Thank you, Jane.
I really liked this book. And I think one of the reasons is you can stop and start so easily. But I got a kick out of this one. Not only is the writer from the same place I was born, she has the same love of books. So I just chose this one because it's got a great title, and I knew it would be all about libraries and obviously the things in them. But I did not know how close this book would come to touching my life in very many ways. If you get the hardcover, I haven't seen the soft cover, but the hardcover book is beautiful and red with this lovely gold impressed lettering. And then on the inside, the end papers are really interesting. A bit of a book review, if you will, about the library fire. And then a photograph of the author and a fake library pocket, which you can still buy at scrapbook type places if you like. I like to put a bookmark in mine, and then I'm ready to go. Susan Orlean began contributing to the New Yorker in 1987 and became a staff writer in 1992. If you read the New Yorker, you're aware that it is one of those literary journalism magazines that we're lucky enough to have in the United States. And there's a good bit of creative writing there, even if it's nonfiction. Orlean's subjects have included umbrella inventors, origami artists, the figure skater Tonya Harding, the basketball star Felipe Lopez, treadmill desks, taxidermy, and gospel choirs. She's also written extensively about animals, including dogs, pigeons, animal actors, oxen, donkeys, mules, and backyard chickens. She has written 8 different books, all of them really interesting. A travel log, A Bullfighter Checks Her Makeup, My Encounters with Extraordinary People, The Orchid Thief, which was made into a movie with Meryl Streep, and it's a little odd too. It's called Adaptation in its film form, and Rin Tin Tin: The Life and the Legend. So if you grew up with Rin Tin Tin, you can read all about the dog and what happens to him. The library book was nominated for the Andrew Carnegie Nonfiction Prize and the LA Times Book Prize. Orlean was chosen as a 2004 Nieman Fellow at Harvard University, and in 2012 she received an honorary Doctor of Humane Letters from the University of Michigan. She has lots of accolades, including judge for the National Book Awards and chair of the Literary Journalism Program at the Banff Center. She was born in Cleveland, that is Shaker Heights, Ohio, to a middle-class family, majoring in history and literature and graduating with honors from the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor. On her way to law school, she ended up writing, which totally distracted her, and then further diverted by the eruption of Mount St. Helens, she began writing for a few West Coast publications. Before the New Yorker, she was a contributing editor at Rolling Stone and at Vogue. She's also written for the Times Magazine, Spy, Esquire, and Outside. The library book turns out to be a labor of love, one which she resists for some time and says things like, somebody ought to write a book about that, but not me. She connects to her mother very firmly through the writing of this book. At the time that she's finishing up, her mom passes away and has had a dementia, And so her memories with her mother in the library become really important to her, more and more important as she finishes the book. She admits being hesitant to write the book, noting that friends don't let friends write books. I'm not sure that's entirely true, but I guess if you're on the wrong foot with your book, suppose your friend can tell you that maybe that one's just not going to come to fruition. Beyond the emotional connection that we learn about with her mom, we also find the magic of libraries in this book, and she discovers it again after visiting one of the public library branches in LA with her son, who wants to do a school project, and it has to be about a city employee, and he chooses a librarian. And again, she thinks someone should write a book about this, not me, but somebody. Her resistance is broken as a part of that tour around the Central Library, and the smoky aroma of a book that a librarian holds out to her and says, "This one came through the fire," really makes her interested. And then the history lesson from that librarian discussing the date, the average temperature of the fire, 2,000 degrees, and the long 7-hour burn. And after all of that discussion and helping her son with his project, she runs home and begins outlining and researching what she'd like to find and include in the book. Orlean studies each floor, its contents, its employees, what was saved, what was sacrificed, and how the library came to be, all relayed in fact and metaphor. And I found it fascinating. I like the way it feels. I like the paper. I wrote all over it, which I don't ordinarily do because I think, books should have another life. But I don't know, maybe this one has to stay on my bookshelves for a while. When the LA Public Library's Central Branch burned April 29th, 1986, no one could have guessed it would take 7 years to resurrect it. While the renovation took 7.5 years, the book itself took 6.5. And in it, the author honors workers, users, and library lovers around the world. Orlean approaches this story seeking answers, whodunit among them, and she tries to consider arson. Is it intentional? Is it, in a place full of paper, an accident? But she also finds out that arson is notoriously difficult to pin down, especially on a particular individual, and it's also hard to name that as a central cause and sure cause of the fire. I know that the structure of the book is a little bit distracting. Each chapter begins with a bibliography of sorts, of books that were burned in the library, some that lived through the fire, and some that were published after the fire. And so I think her design is very intentional. It's not a chronological book by any means, so there's flash forward and flash back, and that's sometimes a little distracting. But this is a sort of library. Each chapter has a volume of its own, and it allows a good reader to kind of dive in and learn a little bit about everything, just in the way that you might if you were reading the shelves in the library and looking at the spines of those books. While Orlean never intended to cover all of the past directors and detail their lives and how they come to work at the library, once she began researching, she could hardly control herself. She had to include these characters, and I do mean characters, especially Charles Loomis, who published his walk across the United States in a journal-like fashion in newspapers, and later takes control of the LA Public Library in the early 20th century. And boy, is he a character, right down to his hats and corduroy suits. She says, the Venn diagram of people who lived in LA and people who ran the LA Public Library was irresistible because it's the perfect meeting of people who have a higher likelihood of being unusual. I never really thought about libraries that way. But today, you might think that libraries aren't very popular. She doesn't speculate on reasons why libraries are, in fact, very popular still in America. She says it has something to do with the sharing economy. That is, we like to reuse things and maybe not keep them for 25 years on the shelf when we're not using them. She says this is a re-energized perspective exemplified in the strength and popularity of libraries, but also of the millennial generation, a group of folks who really like thrifting as well as reusing. Millennials use libraries more than any other living adult generation, period. And libraries currently outnumber Starbucks. There is a statistical study. We continue to open libraries in advance of the number of Starbucks that are opening. With sharing at its core, libraries have a strong future ahead, I think. She reminds us that libraries are our communal mind. If you don't know something, you can go to the library and find out about it. And likely the librarian will help you not only find what you need, but also help you find further material in databases and paper publications. She says, the book's design is important. I didn't want a dust jacket. I didn't want anything between the reader and the book. The book's design then, the textured red cover, gold lettering, and detail, is similar to collections of the best reads, bound in leather, set on library shelves. Maybe some of you have a complete collection. I don't know. I have one that has Shakespeare and the great philosophers and the great scientists. And so that was something I could count on when I was a kid. And always I could count on the public library. I remember the bookmobile, my favorite afternoon entertainment. Mom would go into Handy Andy. I would go into the bookmobile, get my 10, because you could only get 10, and then wait for the next week to return them and collect some more. Mostly at the instigation of my dad, who wanted me to read the classics, and when I found some of them a little dry, he would recommend French novelists because they were much more exciting, he thought. Libraries are precious to those stretching their budgets, especially college students, but also they're harbingers of cultural shifts, especially among staff members, from the days when only men are librarians to the incursion and then acceptance of women in leadership roles, as well as spearheading various library tasks. I hadn't really thought about that too much. My own experience when I was a kid was that so many librarians were women, especially in the public schools, but the San Antonio Public Library taught me differently, and certainly so did my work at the college. Orleans covers the shifts between who should be in charge, providing a few photographs and noting that some librarians are more extraordinary and or unusual than others. She is as likely to note that patrons of the library are as unique as its directors and staff members, including the supposed arsonist, a portrait of whom is provided in the initial vignette in the book. It's very hard to dislike him, even if he's a bit of a salesman type, sort of. The fire, which nearly destroys the Central Library, consumes over 500,000 books and damages another 700,000. One of the largest fires in Los Angeles. It is the single largest library fire in the United States. The Central Library was designed by the architect Bertram Goodhue and opened in 1926 in the middle of downtown Los Angeles at the corner of 5th Street and Flower on the downslope of a rise once known as Normal Hill. The hill used to be higher, but when it was chosen as the site of the library, the summit was clawed off to make it more buildable. At the time the library opened, this part of downtown Los Angeles was a busy neighborhood of top-heavy, half-timbered Victorians teetering on the flanks of the hills. These days, the houses are gone, and the neighborhood consists of dour, dark office towers standing shoulder to shoulder, casting long shafts of shade across what is left of the hill. Central Library is an entire city block wide, but it is only 8 stories high, making it sort of ankle height compared to these leggy office towers. It projects a horizontality that it probably didn't in 1926, when it debuted as the highest point in what was then a modest 4-story tall city center. It's kind of amazing. One additional reason Orlean publishes the book relates to her mom, their shared love of libraries and trips there during Orlean's childhood. Depression-era parents are notable for penny squeezing, and it is this that is the initial allure of the library, a way to have access to good books and the idea that one reads a book to have the experience of reading it. Orlean writes, I grew up in libraries, or at least it feels that way. I was raised in the suburbs of Cleveland, just a few blocks from the brick-faced Bertram Woods branch of the Shaker Heights Public Library System. Throughout my childhood, starting when I was very young, I went there several times a week with my mother. On those visits, my mother and I walked in together, but as soon as we passed through its doors, we split up, and each of us headed to our favorite section. The library might have been the first place I was ever given autonomy. Me too. Even when I was maybe 4 or 5 years old, I was allowed to head off on my own. Then after a while, my mother and I reunited at the checkout counter with our finds. Together, we waited as the librarian at the counter pulled out the date card and stamped it with the checkout machine, that giant fist thumping the card with a loud chunk, printing a crooked due date underneath a score of previous crooked due dates that belonged to other people, other times. She says, the reading of the book was a journey. There was no need for souvenirs. I don't remember a lot of books in our household when I was a girl. There were books and lots of newspapers. My mom would read 2 newspapers a day. Here in Cleveland, she read 3. She just felt like being up on current news was important and also allowed us to connect to the rest of the world. And so the Orleans family bookshelves matched those of my parents very closely. A few good selections, encyclopedias, the Century Dictionary. And my book buying, I believe, was started by those school-sponsored book fairs and the little inserts in the Weekly Reader where you could order books. And if I was a good kid and saved my dollars and my quarters, my mom would order a couple for me, not as many as I wanted. But that was the first experience of mine buying books. And then textbooks for college, and then you save a few of those because they're kind of fantastic. And well, thank goodness for Half Price Bookstore, among other things. I could always fill up the shelves that I had to spare, and I still do that. It's a little nutty. At least twice a year, I cull books, just as you will in a library, and I drag them off to work, and I put them out on a desk in the hallway with a sign that says, free books. And they go, boom, like that. It's amazing. Even stuff I think is too old to be appealing. Students are really into it. Classics that you might not even think they want to read. What is it about libraries? Well, I don't know. The fact that everybody seems equal there, that the librarian is as likely to give you a smile as a shh. But as we know today, it's less important to be quiet in a library and more important to be a patron. Orlean remembers the scarred wooden checkout counters and the librarian's desks as big as boats, and the bulletin board with its fluttering, raggedy notices. The sense of gentle, steadying busyness like water on a rolling boil was just the same. The books on the shelves, with some subtractions and additions, were certainly the same. It wasn't that time stopped in the library. It was as if we were captured here, collected here, and in all libraries, and not only my time, my life, but all human life as well. In the library, Time is dammed up, not just stopped, but saved. The library is a gathering pool of narratives and of the people who come to find them. It is where we can glimpse immortality. In the library, we can live forever. By way of context, when the library began to burn, Orlean was living in New York City. She writes, "While my romance with libraries had not yet been renewed, I cared a lot about books, and I'm sure I would have noticed a story about a massive fire in the library no matter where the library was. The Central Library fire was not minor, not a cigarette smoldering in an ash can that would have gone out without mention. It was a huge, furious fire that burned for more than 7 hours and reached temperatures of 2,000 degrees, so fierce that almost every firefighter in Los Angeles was called upon to fight it. More than 1 million books burned or were damaged. I couldn't imagine how I didn't know an event of this magnitude, especially something involving books, even though I was living on the other side of the country when it occurred." And I tried to think about that when I started reading the book, What Was I Doing in April 1986? No doubt working at San Antonio College, a young married person, and probably visiting the library at least every other day. She goes on to write, "The burning of Central Library in Los Angeles was finally mentioned in the New York Times on April 30th in a story that appeared on A14. The story laid out the basic facts, mentioning 22 people were injured in the blaze and the cause of the fire unknown. The biggest library fire in American history was upstaged by the Chernobyl nuclear meltdown. The books burned while most of us were waiting to see if we were about to witness a nuclear end of the world." So if you don't remember that it happened, that's a huge event in our world culture. And so tells us something about how important things get displaced. As Orlean unveils the complications and results of the fire, her chapter headings reflect the irony of the books listed at the beginning of the chapter, some historical, others published since the fire, but now available on the shelves of LA Central Library, like Fire, 38 Life-Saving Tips for You and Your Family, 1995 by James J. Gibbons, or Fire Behavior and Sprinklers, 1964 by Norman J. Thompson. Fire, Friend or Foe, 1998 by Dorothy Henshaw Patent. As Orlean continues, readers learn about the American Library Association, its shifts and changes over time, its political bent or less political bent, including when women were finally regarded as valuable and irreplaceable employees. Likewise, the array of characters is serendipitous, as the author notes in the book, a cast worthy of the unique flavor of LA in the 21st century. And yet, readers learn about fires, a lot about fires, in fact. I was reintroduced to stoichiometry, which I hadn't really thought about since chemistry class. In the physics of fire, there's a chemical phenomenon known as stoichiometry condition in which a fire achieves the perfect burning ratio of oxygen to fuel. In other words, there's exactly enough air available for the fire to consume all of what it is burning. And I knew about this not just because of chemistry class, but because my brother is a car nut, and my husband as well, and they would, both of them talk about how fuel would ignite, and therefore a discussion of this concept really pulled on my memory. It was fascinating.
What was the word?
Stoichiometric.
Not sociometric.
Stoichiometric. Yeah. So I probably heard that word first from my brother relative to internal combustion. But he was one of those popular science readers, and he rebuilt engines all the time. Stoichiometric condition is almost impossible to create outside of a laboratory. It requires an elusive, precise balance of fuel, fire, and oxygen that in a sense is more theoretical than actual. Many firefighters have never seen such a blaze and never will. One firefighter in particular, Ron Hamill, fought thousands of fires, but he said he had never experienced another that was as exceptional as the fire at Central Library. Usually fire is red and orange and yellow and black. The fire in the library was colorless. You could look right through it as if it were a sheet of glass. Where the flame had any color, it was pale blue. It was so hot it appeared icy. Hamill said he felt like he was standing inside a blacksmith's forge. We thought we were looking at the bowels of hell, he said. Combustion that complete is almost impossible to achieve, but in this case, it was achieved. It was surreal. And that kind of a statement from a firefighter is like hyperbole. They're really telling you something. He further said, in every firefighter's career, there are those fires that are extraordinary and unforgettable. This is one of those. So it's hard to find a firefighter nonplussed about a fire. One of the librarians sort of mentioned to Orlean that the whole of the library and the neighborhood was filled with the smell of heartbreak and ashes. And I thought of that a very profound way to describe it. Orlean writes, finally, after over 5 hours, the liquid spill of flames slowed, yielding to the torrents of water and to the cool air that was wafting through the holes jackhammered through the ceiling and floors. The fire pulled back from the southeast section of the building and curled up in the northeast stacks where it glowered angrily, feeding itself book after book, a monster snacking on chips. The fresh April air mingled with the smothering heat inside, easing the temperature down bit by bit. As the fire shrank, the firefighters dug deeper and drenched it. The flames in the northwest stacks withered and went out. The fire in the northeast stacks where it began still smoldered, but it no longer had the fierceness it had earlier in the day. By this point, it had burned through most of its fuel. The books in the northeast stacks were crumbles, ashes, powder, and charred pages heaped a foot deep. The last flags of fire fluttered, seethed, settled, and finally died. It had required 1,400 bottles of oxygen, 13,440 square feet of salvage covers, 2 acres of plastic sheeting, 90 bales of sawdust, and more than 3 million gallons of water. The majority of the city of Los Angeles firefighting personnel and equipment, but at last the library fire was declared extinguished, a knockdown at 6:30 p.m. on April 26, 1986. It raged for 7 hours and 38 minutes. So just a complete rendering to ash. And she lists what's lost in the fire, a copy of Don Quixote from 1860, among other things, with particular illustrations by a French illustrator, Gustave Doré. All the books about the Bible, about Christianity, everything really toppled in that one particular section. And then as you continue reading the book, what you find is that these librarians, not unlike 9/11 response teams, went in there and started cleaning as soon as they could. And it takes some time for them to achieve their goals. And in the meantime, yes, some of them become ill, breathing that stale air, what's left of the soot and ash in the air there. And any disturbance then would, sweeping would bring forward some dust clouds. And so imagine how difficult that must have been, especially amid all of these treasures that we find in libraries. We know that libraries have burned off and on since we've had libraries in human history. The library at Alexandria burned several times before it's taken down completely. And we don't have any clue what we've lost in these older library fires. In Los Angeles, we know because there is a vast card catalog, even though it is somewhat damaged. There's an ability to go through there and do a book inventory. But mostly what the librarians were able to figure out is just from looking at the shelves alone. The vast number of things were just gone. There are a variety of noteworthy characters in this book, but the most memorable, I think, is Charles Loomis, because his description is so entertaining. And the photographs are as well. Charles Loomis, through a variety of strife and restructuring staff, including setting female leadership aside, becomes the head librarian, his primary duty to attract more patrons. And the book describes him as one of those people who, if he wants to go fishing, he just doesn't come to work and goes fishing. And I kept thinking, what a great job. I'd get caught on the day I went fishing, I'm just sure of it. Charles Loomis arrived in Los Angeles in 1885 when the Los Angeles Times offered him a position on its staff. At the time, he was a newspaper reporter in Ohio. He accepted the offer and packed his belongings. He then decided he would walk from Ohio to California. The first outfit Loomis wore on his trip was a pair of knickers, a flannel shirt, tomato red knee socks, low-cut street shoes, and a canvas coat with 23 pockets, which he filled with odds and ends picked up along the way, including gold nuggets, deer antlers, tobacco, pretty rocks, and rattlesnake skins. Midway through his walk to California, he swapped his knickers for a pair of buckskin leggings. After arriving in Los Angeles, Loomis continued to dress in a manner that was not typical for a Caucasian male of the 1880s. His favorite outfit was a 3-button suit coat and trousers made of bright green, wide-well corduroy, which he wore with a red and black patterned cummerbund. His second favorite outfit was a crop bolero made of suede and a pair of bell-bottom pants that were so tight no one could figure out how he stuffed himself into them. He almost always accessorized with a wide-brimmed Stetson sombrero and a pair of moccasins. He wore these outfits for the rest of his life, including the 5 years he served as city librarian of Los Angeles. I don't know if you can see it very well, but here's a little black and white picture of him striking a pose in his Stetson sombrero.
So his entire tenure was in the 19th century, as librarian?
Yeah.
Okay.
And, Los Angeles has been organized for a good long time. And so the succession of librarians is really fascinating to me. But, we've had libraries since Benjamin Franklin. So that sort of feature of the American profile is a pretty long-standing one. I've got another quote I want to read you. This fellow, Loomis, also built his own home in Los Angeles by collecting rocks and things in a really interesting way. So it's like his whole house is built of found objects, in much the same way he put all those little things in his pocket. Apparently, he gathered things together to build that home. Loomis's efforts to attract more people was so successful, the library soon needed to find larger quarters. Most Los Angeles residents voted in favor of a library building proposition by 1904, but the city had made no effort to move forward with the plan. Loomis signs a lease for the top floor of the Homer Laughlin building across the street from Angel's Flight, a funicular that carried the wealthy residents of Bunker Hill down the sheer side of the hill to the central business district. The Homer Laughlin space was almost twice as large as what the library and City Hall could accommodate, and now there were 123,000 books in the collection. To Loomis's delight, there's also a room for smoking and a rooftop garden. It will not be a toy garden with terracotta teacup flowers, but a real garden, he wrote, probably the only one of its sort in any library in the world. So he's concerned about making the LA Public Library a very special place. Orlean says that she buys a copy of Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451 to see how a book might burn. And, Bradbury lives in Los Angeles, and he calls up the firefighters after he finishes the book, and he says, can you tell me the temperature at which paper burns? And so Fahrenheit 451, and he just appropriates that for the entire book. I don't know that we would love the book any less if it didn't have that great a title, but it's interesting. He's also a person who identifies himself as completely educated by the library. His family, he tells us, is so poor that he can't afford to go to a tuition-oriented school, so he just goes to the library and reads and reads and reads, which tells us that we can do anything if we access the library. We can figure almost anything out. So Orlean buys a copy of Fahrenheit 451 and sets it afire in an outdoor grill, and she and her husband cannot believe how quickly the paper burns. She says, "We were amazed to discover that books catch fire like little bombs. It seemed like the book grabbed the flames and went boom." I remember asking my husband, "Did that just happen?" I kept thinking, wow, that was crazy. It went so fast. There was nothing left. And so she, out of curiosity, wants to see how quickly that might actually occur in a library by using one book in her backyard. This book chronicles almost anything you might like to know more about, including a gentleman known as the Human Encyclopedia. Character after character, every chapter has something interesting for you, and it's not a particularly easy read because you do have to make connections, but it's almost like going to a different shelf in the library every chapter, seeing what she will reveal. Is it person-oriented? Is it fire-oriented? Is it about what's missing or what we now have in the library? Is it about more modern builders of the library? There's something here for everyone. A chronicle of the supposed arsonist, of disease and health, of criminal behavior, court cases, legendary characters including these folks in the book, equipment now obsolete in libraries, and the talent of most of its patrons too, which had expired. But because our love for libraries is regenerated every generation, it is a legacy that we've enjoyed since 1731 with the library established in Philadelphia by Benjamin Franklin. And then libraries are extended in the 19th century. We've got subscription libraries, but also when the oil wealthy begin to spend their money, like Carnegie as an example, more and more libraries are built and endowed. And in fact, they're some of the best places to go to look at artifacts from our time. So if you travel to New York City, the New York Public Library has some amazing things in it. UT Austin Library as well. There's a Gutenberg Bible up there that is generally on display. The papers of many famous writers are stored there. Movie scripts from equally famous script writers. So for all of us, including the little library just to the back of us, there's a little richness there for all of us to discover. I think Orlean is not done with libraries yet, and I don't really want to read you everything, but if you have time, this is kind of a fun read. And it's easy, as I said, to pick up and put down. But for me, I kept leaving myself little notes, like I'm leaving a path, like Hansel and Gretel with breadcrumbs all the way through the book, because I want to remember, if I have to put it down, what I've just read, and I don't really want to go back and reread it, but I did that too. And I found a lot of little tuck-in details, the poetry that Loomis writes, just little bits and pieces about these individuals involved, I found really fascinating. And the story of our presumed arsonist isn't a terribly happy one. He's one of the first group of young people to die from AIDS. And he finds out later in the 80s that he's suffering, and there's really at that time not much that helps deter that disease. Chapter 32, The End of the Story, a play in one act, 1954 by Richard Thomas. The End of the Story, 2004 by Lydia Davis. The End of the Story, 2012 by Liliana Hacker. This is the End of the Story, 2017, Jan Fortune. January 1 is the day of the Rose Bowl Parade in Pasadena. The Los Angeles Public Library always has a float in the parade. Every year the parade has a theme. In 1993, the theme was Entertainment on Parade. The library float featured a giant bookworm reading a newspaper. One of the people riding beside the bookworm was city librarian Elizabeth Martinez, who was appointed to the job after Wyman Jones retired in 1990. The newspaper that the bookworm was reading displayed a headline that said, Central Library reopens October 3, 1993. Robert Reagan, the public information officer of the library from 1980 to 1998, said that publicizing the date at the Rose Bowl might have been tempting fate, but he really believed they would make it. There was still a lot to do. As the date approached, the library held bookshelving parties, and hundreds of volunteers helped unpack 2 million books and place them on the new shelves. The parties were a little like a volunteer turnout after a fire, but in terms of mood, it was the mirror opposite, an occasion for optimism and renewal. I like to work with books, one of the volunteers told a reporter who asked why she was giving her time. Then she added by way of complaint, today there were a lot of very young children getting underfoot and doing nothing. They slowed down the shelving. She paused and added, but working to help open the library is personally very satisfying. Library administration, with help from ARCO, planned a spectacular opening celebration featuring Brazilian folk dancers, Japanese drummers, flamenco performers, West African singers, Korean musicians, demonstrations by the cast of American Gladiators, and appearances by Spider-Man, Daffy Duck, and Bugs Bunny. At the end of Harry Peake's tale came with no clarity. He's the supposed arsonist. In effect, it was more of an erasure than a conclusion. It didn't resolve the question who had started the fire or whether anyone had started the fire, nor did it ever provide a final immutable version of how Harry Peake spent the day April 29, 1986. It didn't answer whether he was or wasn't the human hand holding an open flame. I seesawed countless times on what I believed really happened, in particular whether Harry was involved. Each time I thought I'd settled on the version of the story I trusted, something arose to punch a hole in it, and I was back at the beginning. In the end, I had no idea what was true or even what I decided to believe. I finally accepted ambiguity. I knew for sure that once upon a time, the Los Angeles Central Library suffered a terrible fire, and a fumbling young man was caught up in it. Beyond that was all uncertainty, the way life almost always is. It would remain a story without end, like a suspended chord in the last measure of a song, that singular, dissonant, open sound that makes you ache to hear something more. I went to the library late one day, just before closing time, when the light outside was already dusky and the place was sleepy and slow. Central Library and the Bradley Wing are so big that when the crowds thin out, the library can feel very private, almost like a secret place, and the space is so enveloping that you have no sense of the world outside. I went down to history to see Glenn Creason and find out how the indexing of the Feathers map collection was progressing. Then I roamed from department to department, just strolling through, and crossed the beautiful hollow rotunda, a gorgeous surprise every time I entered it, and then went up into the wide lap of the back staircase, where the statue of civilization stared at me as I made my way. The silence was more soothing than solemn. A library is a good place to soften solitude, a place where you feel part of a conversation that has gone on for hundreds and hundreds of years, even when you're all alone. The library is a whispering post. You don't need to take a book off a shelf to know there's a voice inside waiting to speak to you, and behind that, someone who truly believed that if he or she spoke, someone would listen. It was that affirmation that always amazed me. Even the oddest, most peculiar book was written with that kind of crazy courage, the writer's belief that someone would find his or her book important to read. I was struck by how precious and foolish and brave that belief is, and how necessary, and how full of hope it is to collect these books and manuscripts and preserve them. It declares that all these stories matter, and so does every effort to create something that connects us to one another, and to our past, and to what is still to come. I realized that this entire time, learning about the library, I'd been convincing myself that my hope to tell a long, lasting story, to create something that endured, to be alive somehow as long as someone would read my books, was what drove me on, story after story. It is my lifeline, my passion, my way to understand who I am. I thought about my mother, who died when I was halfway done with this book, and I knew how pleased she would have been to see me in the library. And I was able to use that thought to transport myself for a split second to a time when I was young, and she was in the moment, alert and tender, with years ahead of her, and she was beaming at me as I toddled to the checkout counter with an armload of books. I knew that if we had come here together to this enchanted place of stucco and statuary and all the stories in the world for us to have, she would have reminded me just about now that if she could have chosen any profession in the world, she would have been a librarian. Security guards began arranging chairs and straightening tables while calling out, 4 minutes, 4 minutes to closing. The few of us here snapped our books shut and swept our belongings together and headed upstairs. In the checkout line, a heavy-set man with 3 books under his arm began a jiggling, hip-wagging dance, and people stepped around him carefully on their way out the door. Yeah, this one really got me. But you know, us English teachers, there's always a book, there's always a story, there's always something to share, and every time we share it, there's something new to discover. And that's what libraries really do for all of us. So, you know, if you're having a glum day, sometimes a little trip to the public library down the corner, where you see people coming and going and kids filing through the areas they love the best and picking up all their favorite books, that just gives you some kind of hope in human nature, because we're all in the library looking for something to connect to. So I'm hoping you've read some of the book, maybe. And if you haven't had time to do so, I would urge you to use it as one of those quiet little interludes, a chapter at a time. And you'll see yourself in this book too, I think. Yes, ma'am.
This book kept hooking me one chapter at a time. I didn't think I'd ever make it through it, but I kept getting hooked into it.
Yeah.
And I realized how much I learned about just how a library runs.
Yes.
That it probably would be some dry required reading for somebody in library science on those details, but the way the details are dropped in around the storyline kept hooking me to read a little bit more.
You did get an introduction to all those courses you would take in library school, definitely. And because I started working in the library when I went to SAC after graduation, I knew all those nooks and crannies in our library and all those people that did those bits of work and who put the labels on and, who glued the X and then, to the student assistants who would take the carts out and put the books on the shelves for the first time. And so, I'm still really linked to the library. In fact, we're getting ready to move the Writing Center into the library at SAC, because if we have the Writing Center here next to the reference desk, it'll be really obvious. There won't be any getting around the idea that, if you're going to write, you need the library and you need the librarians. So I found it a little too close sometimes. A little too close. It's, God, stop that. You don't even know me. How can you know so much about me? And it's about the library, really.
Jane,
Yes, ma'am.
as a former librarian, I just adored it. But I want you to know that I was the bookmobile lady. And so was Jane.
That's awesome.
The summer that she worked there too.
Well, I had to get my mom to write me a note because I wanted to also check out grown-up books. And the librarians were very careful, denying me that first time and just saying, well, you can just go get your mama and I'll keep your books right here, and if she says it's okay, you can have them. Okay. So when Mom was done and handy, that's what we did. And then I had a note in my little purse that I would take with me every time. And after a while, the gentleman who was there most frequently, I know, Jane, I know. And librarians also sponsored a lot of reading contests in the summer, and you could read, 100 books, 200 books, and you'd get a little certificate. And so I went and I just read all these books I loved anyway, and the librarian said, I'm not going to give you a star today because you could read more challenging books. I know who you are. But I read them. Yes, how many times have you read them? Okay, I'll go read something new. So, librarians gently push you in a lot of different directions. And honestly, I couldn't have finished my thesis for my master's degree without the librarians at SAC, who, if they didn't already have the books on the shelf, would get them through interlibrary loan for me. And, you don't even have to go anywhere. You just have to check in with your library friends. So, I don't know what to say about libraries. I've been in and out of them since I was a wee person, and I can't stop myself.
That's the wonderful connection we now have with the online capabilities.
Yeah.
It's not only the physical library loan. It used to be they shipped it one place to another. You can get things electronically that way.
Yes.
And from tiny little libraries in the northern corner of Minnesota who happen to have it, and it shows up on WorldCat.
Yeah.
So libraries are really working to stay so vital, to kind of change a little bit as the needs.
Oh, absolutely. And they save money by sharing their books in that way. And, that's the beauty of it. You don't have to go to Minnesota to get the book. You can get an electronic copy. A lot of times when I was doing my research, they would just send a Xerox of the chapter before and the chapter after the chapter I needed, because some crafty librarian's thinking, I think she needs this too. And so I didn't even have to ask sometimes. Another sort of uncanny understanding that librarians have about their patrons. I think it's amazing.
It's wonderful that you can now talk in a library and children can laugh and play, and there's none of that, which I remember.
Oh, yeah.
And it's just such freedom, and my gosh, you go in the library and there's so many people in there doing all kinds of things.
Right,
Computers,
genealogy,
children.
yeah, it's a wonderful place to learn just about anything.
Yeah.
And, you can get art lessons there too, because they document the art inside the library so well. You don't have to ask a lot of questions. Libraries fascinate me. I just finished working with the public library on the Young Pegasus program, and, so we read like 1,800 poems by students from 4 to 18, and then we pick a small number that we publish. And I'll tell you what, these young students are really thoughtful. Because we're not picking easy poems. We're picking really thoughtful, thought-provoking, metaphor-driven ideas. And even though not all schools teach those features anymore, there's definitely some teachers out there that are really concerned about younger people being able to articulate themselves in very broad ways. And so I would say probably librarians are responsible for a good bit of vocabulary development among students as well. Another place where you didn't get baby talk, you got real words. And so, wow, bibliography was a big one when I was a kid, but I learned very young what exactly that was. And, my mom and dad did not let me get away with much. If I didn't understand what a word meant, my mom would say, well, go pick up your dictionary. And so I had my older brother's dictionary that I ran around with for a good long time, and then it became less necessary to look everything up. But you don't know what that word means? Have you tried the dictionary? No. Well, go try. Yes, ma'am.
I don't know, this is an open question. Are they still in elementary schools taking the children to the library once a week and letting them take a book out? Are they teaching them how a library is organized, how to find a book in a
that's kinda
library?
up
What
and
do you
down.
do in a library? Are they still doing that?
The one I tutor in does. All those little
Good.
elementary children have a time through the library.
That's
It's a
good.
school library. It's a school library.
Yes, yes.
There
Yeah.
isn't as much contact I have found with the public libraries because a parent must go to that library and set up kind of a card.
Mhm.
They have to prove residency and set up a card.
Mhm.
And in some of our schools, that's not something the parent is comfortable with.
Mhm.
But in the school, learning how to use the library. And sometimes there are media centers that are adjacent to the library, so they learn how to use the computer online research too.
Yeah, the public library has a homework hotline. You can type your questions in, and the librarians will help you out.
Wow.
And they have great summer programs at the branches as well as at the downtown public library. If you haven't visited the main library, I would urge you to go. It's beautiful, but also go up to the children's floor. You will be amazed at the number of books that students have access to. And then when they get too used, they go down to the booksellers, CELLAR, and they're sold very inexpensively. And, we continue to, hook readers that way. Yeah. Yes, sir?
I especially like the way the title of this book captures the concept of the library book. I mean, the title of the book, but it illustrates the essence of what a true the library book is. This isn't simply about a library, but it's about a particular kind of library, a public library of a city. I mean, there's all kinds of magnificent libraries of universities and institutions. Medical schools have their own libraries, but a city library that makes available to its citizens for free, great quality books that can be checked out, and of course other media now too, but of course to me, there's nothing quite like getting a well packaged actual hardback book that you can check out from the library. Have a library book. I mean, you feel like you're honored to have in your hands a library book that has been entrusted to you by your city. And cities have so many other concerns. There's police, there's garbage collection, there's fixing the roads and the potholes and all these other things that take up the money. And how do the libraries manage to keep the interest and the funding? Because it takes a lot to keep these libraries going. But it's quite remarkable and quite wonderful that there is an honor given to books and public libraries in this way. It was helped, of course, by, I didn't even know that our old Baby Elephant Library on Market Street was at Carnegie Library. It was one of the many Carnegie libraries, but it was that was the one that I was introduced to as a child, and would turn left to the children's section as you went into the lobby of that one. But the Enchilada Library, now the main library, is a must-see. If you haven't gone there, you know, the only thing is we need to get together and campaign for the parking. The city, the rates that they charge are a little bit less than other available parking downtown, and so people that use parking downtown come and fill it up, and so there's no convenient parking for library users. You know, you have to circle up and go all the way to the roof to find a place to park.
It's hard to believe that was Sears.
That's not right.
That's the old Sears building.
I took that to the city via phone because I run into some problems with that. And it's an interesting story in itself, but here again, it is the fact that it is a public, it is a city facility. The garage and the library, kind of separate entities, but next door to one another. But because the city is responsible and kind of oversees all of this, when you go down to our city library now, I was just kind of taken aback being there when the doors first opened, with the physical nature and appearance of the crowd that went in when it was opened. Because our city library is a cooling station for street people when it's extremely hot. It is a place where people rush in to use the computer sections because they're doing applications and trying to do that type of work to get jobs. And then you go up to the various levels and you have all this wonderful space that you can sit and study and research in. And some beautiful art as well. But it's a downtown library that really serves every level of human being within our city in some way.
And the high school across the street.
Right.
You know, I don't think they have a library anymore because of their proximity to the public library. So you'll very often find Fox Tech students over there studying.
Well, the other thing that I think people need to realize is that our library downtown has the most beautiful Chihuly sculpture, glass sculpture, which is worth, I don't even know how much. I mean, it's got to be worth thousands of dollars. And it's hanging there for everybody to see, just walk in and there it is. So
It is gorgeous.
it's another introduction to art that our library provides.
Well, you know, the library does rely on residents of the city to help serve in a lot of different capacities, and they look for folks all the time to help them out with various projects. So if you're not busy enough, you might give them a call. They have a wonderful teen section in the library. I don't know what that would have done for my generation if there had been a teen section. Maybe lots more giggling, but also the number of young adult writing that is done in the United States far surpasses adult writing. And so the sheer number of books that young people have access to, you know, it used to be kind of Beverly Cleary, and you know, you had Dr. Seuss, you had a broad ability to read and access to those books, but wow, partial floors of the library are filled with children's books and teen books, and they have a space that they feel comfortable in, and you know, the little ones have a sort of a play area and lots of reading opportunities with librarians and local folks volunteering to read. So I don't know, libraries are pretty important. A few years ago I went to see Jane Goodall speak at the auditorium, and you couldn't get a ticket if you didn't belong to the library. And you had to go to the library to get your ticket. I thought that was just the best because it drove people back into the library. And when my mom was having trouble with her eyesight, I was able to get almost every popular novel in large print for her. And it wasn't difficult. I just went over to Westfall and looked at her list and found pretty much everything that she wanted to read. And the Texas State Library continues to supply reading materials for the sight impaired. So she had library books on little MP3s for the rest of her life. And, you know, she enjoyed reading. She had a series of books about a variety of ethnic groups in the United States, and reflections on farming inside of the stories. And she get a little worn out on that farming part because she and my dad did that, and I still cannot conceive of my mother with chicks and lambs in her kitchen. My mom was the kind of person, she'd get the floor clean and she'd walk around and pick up the fuzz left on the carpet by hand, you know. So I can't even conceive of her we had one dog in the house and that didn't last very long. So I just have no idea how she would fill her kitchen with spring lambs and chicks and just let them be there. I just can't. My brothers laugh every time we talk about it. Anyway, do you all have any other questions or observations you'd like to make about libraries? Well, thank you for assigning me a book that I really enjoyed.